Hi, my name's Cecilia Poullain, and welcome to this episode of Brave New Women. All around the world, there are amazing, ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Brave New Women is about giving those women a platform and a voice, and it's about changing the way that women are perceived. And it's a way of inspiring all of us to do the things that we've always wanted to do. Today, I'm so pleased to be talking to Judith Nguyen. Now, Judith is a New Zealander, and she started her career as an English teacher in Saigon in Vietnam. Her last position, before she retired, was as Director of Communications Policy in the Department of Premier and Cabinet in Tasmania. Judith has also received an Order of Australia for her services to the community, especially in the area of arthritis. Today, I'm talking to Judith about the Haven Education Project, which is a project intended to provide opportunities for education for clever but disadvantaged students in central Vietnam. Welcome, Judith.
Good to be with you.
Before we dive into the Haven Education Project, I'd like to ask you, how did you go from New Zealand to your first job, which was as an English teacher in Saigon? How did that happen?
Well, I guess my Vietnam story started in 1965. I was at the University of Auckland in my second year of an arts degree, and my flatmates and I went to an international students' dance during orientation week. And this really gorgeous-looking Asian guy asked me to dance. He had the most beautiful smile and white teeth and twinkly eyes. And it turned out that he was a Colombo Plan scholar from Vietnam, in the first group of Vietnamese students to go to Australasia. And they landed in Wellington, where he learned English for 6 months, did his undergrad work at Canterbury University in engineering, and moved to Auckland to do his PhD. And that's when I met him. And over the months, we gradually fell in love. And I learned a lot about his family. Basically, he came from central Vietnam. And if you can picture Vietnam, it's like a dog's bone, a big bit, skinny bit, and a big bit at the bottom. The big bit at the top is the north. The skinny bit is central Vietnam, which is the very poorest part of Vietnam, and then the south, the Delta area, which is quite prosperous. Anyway, he came from a city called Vinh, and Vinh was subject to the scorched earth policy by the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh's people, who were very determined to, oust French rules. And so the city was razed. The family, the whole city basically ran into the jungle. And they were there for several years, during which his parents died, as well as brother. So there was Talal, age 7, an older brother, 13, another 16, and a sister who was just 4.
Gosh.
And that story, it just resonated with me that these 4 kids could pick themselves up and carry on with life, but realising that they had to be educated to be saved.
How were they with surviving in the jungle?
Well, they were with their parents for a few years, and then the parents died, the brother. So they moved with the community down to Hue. And basically those children, the 3 boys, into living they were clever, by tutoring their fellow students, by doing French translation. They were all fluent in French because their father had been a professor of French literature at the Collège de Vinh. And so every year they set a scholarship which would take them to the next level. Tom gained a scholarship to go to high school to Quoc Hoc Hue, which is a very famous boys' school for gifted boys, and it's got a sister school for girls. And so he got into that school, encouraged academically, and then he got his Colombo Plan Scholarship. And that's how he ended up in New Zealand in 1916. And basically that was the start of his academic career when he got his PhD. But the thing about the Colombo Plan Scholarship, which was set up by Commonwealth countries in the 50s, was that it was for bright students from developing countries. And he was one of those bright students from a now disadvantaged background. But they were expected to go home when they'd finished their studies because it was a wealthy scholarship. They didn't have to work part-time. They were supposed to study and do well, which they did. So once I'd finished uni, finished my teaching quals, and so in August 1969, we went to live in Saigon.
And how was that for you?
Well, I'd been overseas to Australia and I think New Caledonia, but just flying in Saigon over the Mekong Delta, it was just like in the geography books at primary school, that beautiful delta system laid out in front of us. I was just ecstatic. Of course, when we got on the ground, all the paraphernalia of war was evident. You know, warplanes everywhere, barbed wire everywhere, soldiers on street corners. But we found a place, an apartment. He quickly got a job at the Ho Chi Minh University of Technology, where he ended up as the deputy director at Talal, the engineering branch. And I got a job at the international school. And I was teaching, okay, I hadn't had much teaching practice, but I had the qualifications and the knowledge, I guess. And most of my students were the children of diplomats whose parents wanted them to be educated in English. You know, they could learn French or Vietnamese as a sideline, but they basically wanted their children to go to an English language school. And so we lived quite happily there for nearly 7 years. I did go back to New Zealand twice on working holidays to give birth to my children, my daughter and son, so that they would have New Zealand passports in case something happened. And what happened, of course, in April 75, the ambassador's driver turns up and says, we've got 2 hours to leave. 1 suitcase, 2 hours, we'll be back to get you. Well, it did help that my children had New Zealand passports and me, and my parents also on the phone to the New Zealand Prime Minister reminding them that their son-in-law had studied for 10 years in New Zealand and, get their act together. And ultimately, he did join us in New Zealand. And that's what started his career at the University of Auckland, my career as a secondary school teacher at Howard College.
I'd like to dig a little bit deeper, Judith, into what it was actually like living in Saigon during the war.
Well, it's kind of hard to believe, but as long as you abided by the rules, then the biggest rule was curfew. You had to be home by 12. And occasionally you'd read in the paper about some foreigner cycling home after their last bowl of pho, at 12:15, and they'd get a warning shot from the military police. They kept on cycling. Second shot hit the bicycle, third shot hit them. So we didn't have any problem being home by midnight. Also, I never walked on the side of the street where the American forces were based, usually in big hotels in the city, all barbed wired up, but I never went near them. And also never ran over a plastic bag on the street.
Because?
A bomb. And initially, my husband and I had a Vespa. And, of course, those were the days, the 60s. I wore mini skirts, mini dresses. I was slim. But you had to sit side saddle. So because And I'd say, why do I have to sit side saddle? I know that I have to have my knees together so nobody can see my underwear. It was to prevent people throwing grenades, basically, being on the back of a motorbike and being able to throw a grenade. So you had to sit sideways. But, you know, we adjusted, and it was such a dynamic city, even though it was at war. I mean, occasionally, and also we rented a villa halfway between the airport and the Parliament building, reckoning that if bombs were going to come over, they would probably not hit us. And they didn't. But every so often you'd get a B-52 bomber fly over and the windows would crack. But we had them taped up, and so the glass would just fall in a sticky mess. But, you know, it was surprisingly normal, really. I went to school every day. Tom went to university. We socialised freely, and of course we had that advantage of having an expat community of New Zealanders and Vietnamese, Vietnamese, New Zealanders and Australians. And it was interesting meeting people from all parts of the world. But of course, there was always, and you know, the media was very censored, so you never got to see the gory details of the war. But one thing I did insist when we got the house was that we have a phone installed, and that wasn't very common in Vietnamese, so that my parents could ring me and I could ring them. And of course, on the New Zealand news, they saw all the terrible things happening and thought it was happening to us. But it was really only in the last few weeks that we were there that I was frightened. The thing about Vietnam is that the Vietnamese are so resilient. So we arrived in 1969, and the first thing we had to do was fly to Hue to meet Tom's family, his sister and his brother, his older brother and his sister. The other brother lived elsewhere. And we went on their Vietnam plane, going along quite happily. And then suddenly the siren sounded and the plane went straight down, and I just we clutched onto each other. But apparently it was a warning that this was a civilian plane. Please don't shoot.
Gosh.
Of course, when we drove in from the airport into the city, we could see the damage that had been done by the 1968 Tet Offensive. Even though the minute it happened, Vietnamese would get to work rebuilding in order to maintain morale. But as a result of the Tet Offensive of 1968, a lot more military resources were put in place to guard Saigon. And so I actually felt quite safe there. I mean, occasionally there were nuisance things happening, like perhaps every 2 or 3 months the gate bell would ring and our helper would go and answer it, and it would be the military police needing to check our papers. And after a while, first I'd get up and hurriedly get dressed while they searched the house to make sure we weren't harbouring any Viet Cong. After a while, I'd just stay in bed and we'd be marauding in the house. And they'd see this Western woman in this bed, and they'd go, ooh. So a few funny moments. We adjusted very much to life, and we were heartbroken to leave. I remember crying all the way to Singapore, and Tom didn't get out with us. The New Zealand government did want to have caused trouble with the Vietnamese government. But I stayed in Singapore and basically waited and harangued the New Zealand embassy until one day I, sitting on the bed in the hotel, nursing Andrew, who was 8 months old, Sarah's 3, playing on the floor. And I looked up, and there was Tom. And he said, I thought you might need this. And it was one of those umbrella pushchairs, because Andrew was quite a big baby. It's all he brought out of Vietnam. And he was thinking of me and our little boy. But, you know, again, it comes back to education. We had earning power because we were both well educated.
I find that incredibly moving, actually, that
I still cry about
story.
it. It was just so shocking. But, we found jobs in Auckland. We moved on. Our children went to kindy, went to school. They both did very well. And then ultimately we moved to Australia in 1989 when Tong was appointed the first Vietnamese professor of electrical engineering and telecommunications in Australasia.
Gosh. How was his experience? I know this is not what we're meant to be talking about on the podcast, but how was his experience as a Vietnamese man in Australia? And also, what was the experience of your children?
Absolutely fine, I guess. And even in New Zealand, he was an associate professor at the University of Auckland. Well, the day we arrived in Auckland, basically as refugees, he went to the University of Auckland and they gave him a job as a tutor.
Oh, gosh.
And his PhD there. Kind of a few weeks later, he became a lecturer. And then, senior lecturer, and ultimately he was an associate professor. But we moved to Australia because it seemed to us that it was more multicultural. New Zealand education system is still very steeped, I think, in the Oxbridge model, particularly when it comes to appointments of senior academics. And I think at some point Tom realised that because he wasn't a graduate of Oxford or Cambridge, it was probably better to seek his fortune in a more multicultural country like Australia, which he did. And so we were in Hobart for 16 years. And then we retired to Sydney in 2005. And during those years in Hobart, he was busy at the university. He was also dean of the faculty as well as professor. He was busy. I decided to change occupations. So often you hear that teachers can't do anything except teach, and they have about 20 weeks holiday a year. But actually teachers have got lots of skills. They can talk, they can write, they can work in teams, they can analyse, all sorts of things. So I actually just started working as a corporate communications expert at a couple of companies, and then worked my way up to being Director of Communications Policy at Premier and Cabinet.
An amazing career for you as well, for both of you.
Yeah, it was good. And it was interesting because lots of my New Zealand friends, my colleagues, my dear friends, also left teaching after about 20 years. Teaching is jolly hard work. And if you're dedicated to it like we were, after 20 years, you do actually need to move on. But all of them managed to find other interesting jobs.
I suppose the other thing that teachers know how to do is to learn.
That's right. Like I'm a website administrator. I've learned how to develop and manage and administer and publish on a website.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Now let's move to what we were meant to be talking about. I mean, you've had a fascinating life, but let's move to the Haven Education Project. So, can you tell me what was it? How did it start?
Right. Well, we retired to Sydney in 2005, and before then, Tom was appointed a visiting professor at the National University of Vietnam in Hanoi. So we actually started going there 2 or 3 times a year. And it was basically to help the Vietnamese government with their engineering curricula, bring it up to speed, international standard, etc. And I found interesting things to do, like I worked at the I volunteered at the National Women's Museum. All their stuff was wonderful, but it was in Vietnamese, French, and very bad English. So basically, I I rewrote all their English language materials. So there we are, going to Vietnam 2 or 3 times a year, and we're thinking this is the time when we could actually do something for poor, disadvantaged, but really bright children in Vietnam, just like Tong was. And our children too used to say, Mum, Dad, why are these kids, why aren't they at school? Because whilst Vietnamese primary education is compulsory in New Zealand, in Vietnam, but for secondary you have to sit an entrance exam and you have to pay basically. And lots of families simply can't afford it. Anyway, we were in Vietnam and Tom was in Hue, and somehow he was back at Quoc Hoc. I think the rector wanted to talk to him about something. And he was introduced to this Vietnamese woman called Dr. Quay. And she was the president of the Alumni Association of the girls' school next door, but also a retired doctor, lecturer. But she'd started a little project of raising funds for the poor girls at the school. She could see they were really bright, but didn't have a hope in Hades of ever going on to university. So she was telling Tom about this, and together they decided that we'd start the Haven. Now, of course, we had to have a Vietnamese sponsor. When Tom was evacuated from Vietnam in 1975, he lost his Vietnamese citizenship right then and there. He became a New Zealand citizen and an Australian citizen. But we had to have a Vietnamese citizen to procure the license. We decided we didn't want to set up an orphanage, and it wasn't going to be a charity. It was going to be strictly for bright children who are very disadvantaged, living in the area around Hue, which is one of the poorest parts of Vietnam. So that was it. Dr. Quay got the paperwork done. Tom and I went in search of an appropriate building because we planned to take in 25 or 30 students. And we actually found a former university dormitory, privately owned, a little bit out of the town, but it had the big kitchen, it had the rooms for beds, it had a classroom thing where people did their homework, I guess, the students, and it also had what they called a guard room at the front. So we took a 10-year lease on it, did it up, and further down the track when we decided to take more senior students, grade 10 to 12, we actually built on to the building. So the building was set. Now we had to recruit our students. Now, Tom and Dr. Quay set up a management team, again, mostly retired teachers. One was an accountant, one was became the treasurer, another one was the English language tutor, another one was the computer tutor, etc. And they became the management team. And we set the criteria as very strict criteria, basically. Had to be extremely poor, maybe one parent, disabled parents, but they had to be bright kids. And the idea was to tap into the feeder primary schools in the area, and they would put forward the names of students who met at least, say, 3 out of 4 of the criteria. And that's how the kids came to the Haven. So then we thought about funding. Well, Tom and I, we did the capital funding. We paid for everything. But our children spoke up and said, well, look, we've got good jobs. My daughter's a radiologist, and my son at the time was with the Macquarie Bank as an economist. And they said, look, I'm sure we can ask our friends to help fund this thing. So in the end, there were 10 young couples, basically, young professional couples, who paid the operating costs, all the running costs. which meant clothing, books, laptop, bicycle, school fees, the whole box and dice. Because we didn't set up a charity. We didn't ever seek donations. I guess because we were being the purist, we wanted to run it so that we got the right students who would then go on and make such a difference to their lives and the lives of their families and ultimately Vietnam. So it just worked beautifully. And so that happened for 10 years. Sadly, my husband died in Vietnam really, really suddenly, had a major heart attack. But we did keep it going. But we recruited a young woman, Miss Van, who was our liaison person because she spoke really good English. My Vietnamese is terrible. I mean, I do speak Vietnamese, but not in a business sense. And we recruited her to be our liaison, to keep us in touch with what was going on. Andrew took over his father's role. He became financial director, but also the quality assurance. And the standard remained high. But, my son, he didn't have that knowledge of the education system in Vietnam or overseas education systems, except the ones he went through. And it became obvious that we would have to hand it over to someone else. We definitely didn't want to disband it. Now, because the Haven did so well, and periodically we got kids who did totally brilliantly, got into co-op, etc. There was quite often little bits in the newspaper about this place, and this student had done this, the student had done that, and they got quite a few scholarships from all the things like banks who are always happy to support, students. And then we were approached by a group called Untitled Chapter. And they're an organisation that is headquartered in France, and it comprises VietQ, which is the name for overseas Vietnamese, French Vietnamese living in France. And I haven't met any of them. I've only met the manager. But I suspect they came from that area. They came from away. And they've ended up in France. And they've thought, we'll start this foundation. And they called it Đức Sơn Child, after a pagoda in Hue, where they did their first bit of charity work. Now, it's quite different from the way we operated. They actually run a business. They fundraise frantically in France and Vietnam, and they support orphanages and pagodas and all sorts of things. But they were interested in taking on the Haven. And so they did. They've reduced the number of students from 40 to 30. But apart from that, the same administrator that we had living in that little sort of like studio room at the front of the school, she lives there. She keeps everything on track. And there's a cook and a matron and, the volunteers come in. And so it's actually running pretty much as we ran it, except it's a huge organisation, I gather, with the headquarters in France and in Saigon. So it's still going, and I still get reports, and I get cards from the kids.
Tell me about some of the students that went through. Are there any that particularly you remember particularly?
Yes. I mean, they've all done amazingly well. Of the 112 that attended during our part of the project, 64 gain entry to university, which is very hard to do in Vietnam. It's state universities are the creme de la creme. The private schools tend to be not such a high standard. But by the time Tom had died, I think something like 14 had already graduated. And two of them I'm particularly fond of. And one's a girl called Knock. And she came from a very, very poor family. Her father was a rice farmer, and he also had a small orchard of fruit trees, but her mother was blind. So Knock explained she was able to do the housework and help her husband a bit, but basically they were extremely poor. Knock was very clever. And I think her parents, she told me once that her mother would have preferred her to stay home, look after her, get married, have children, all that. But apparently a neighbour told her parents about the haven, and that's how she ended up. She quickly took to learning English, and she gained entry to the University of Economics in Ho Chi Minh, which is one of the best universities in Vietnam. And she's since graduated, and she's got a really good job at a bank. I think she's already had several promotions. Marvellous young woman. And then another one was a boy called Tuan. Again, he came from the poorest family in Lui village, hamlet, really. And his father was dead. His mother was a nurse, but she'd had to give up because she had cancer. And this boy got it into his head that he wanted to further his education and hopefully become a doctor so that he could help others and maybe even help his mother. He was bright. He got a scholarship to Quoc Hoc. And then he sat the entrance exams for the Hue Medical School. Again, one of the best medical schools in Vietnam. And he came second in the entrance exam. He got 28.5 out of 30.
Gosh.
Now, he graduated in 2020 and he works as a doctor at the Hue General Hospital.
Oh, my goodness.
But lots of them have done. But I'm particularly fond of those two because they were kind of the leadership team. And every year in January, the students meet at the Haven. They have a reunion.
Mm.
And I know that when my husband died, Locke didn't think about classes or anything. She got on an overnight train to Hue so she could give the eulogy at his funeral in Vietnamese and English.
Gosh.
They're just those kind of kids.
Wow.
Because the thing about Vietnam is Vietnamese are crazy about education. You know, in the olden days, there used to be the king, the parent, and the teacher. Well, kings are well gone. So the parents have got huge status, but the teacher does too. And Vietnamese know that the only way you can, because there's not really a class system in Vietnam, it's social mobility is based on your level of education.
Mm.
That's how you get jobs. That's how you do well. That's how you bring esteem to your family.
It's very egalitarian in some ways.
It is. I remember among my earliest memories of arriving in Saigon is that people would ask us for dinner, and along one wall of the lounge, there was always a blackboard, the whole length of the wall of the lounge. And their little kids would be at that blackboard with their chalk doing their maths and what have you. It was just kind of part of life, really.
Mm. Wow.
And the literacy rate in Vietnam, I think I've only got the stats for about 2019, but something like 95%.
Gosh.
Which is amazing. And I think among women it's higher. But the government does have a policy of pursuing education, but also equality of gender. So gender parity is pretty well 50-50.
Gosh.
In fact, I think the stats I've seen show that about 50.7% is the percentage of girls getting, say, to primary school and saying, I've looked at secondary school and university figures, and they're still really high.
So, and does that then translate into jobs? Do you know the figures for the...
No, traditionally Vietnam, way back when, it was a matriarchal society. Of course, that's not the case anymore, except by law, women retain their maiden names. People were very surprised in Vietnam that I'd taken my husband's name. They never do that. Of course, I wished I hadn't. But, this was the 60s. You kind of did. Now I've lost my train of thought.
You were talking about women in whether the women were in jobs. Yeah.
Yes. So traditionally, I think the women might not be seen as the head of the house, but they are. They manage everything. They hold the purse strings. They manage the kids. They manage the house. And, of course, a lot of this has come because of long history of war, where men toddled off to the battlefield and left the women to do everything. We build houses when they fell down. We plant rice when it was bombed out. So Vietnamese women look delicate, but, oh my gosh, they're strong. And now, increasingly, they're getting into senior positions in government and in politics. But Vietnamese women, I think, regard themselves as equal. Those girls at the Haven certainly thought they were equal to the boys.
I mean, that is just such, compared to the stories that I hear in the rest of the world, I mean, that is just so encouraging, both in terms of how important education is and in terms of equality. I just think it's so encouraging.
That's right, that gender parity in education, it's really heartwarming. I mean, if push came to shove in a very poor family and they couldn't afford to send their kids to school, they'd probably have the boys go to school and the girls stay home. But generally speaking, girls are given the same opportunities. And really the only areas of Vietnam which is lagging behind in educational achievement and literacy are the ethnic groups like the Montagnards who live in the highlands of Vietnam. Some of those ethnic groupings, they've still got quite high illiteracy. But there are UNESCO is running programs to kind of try and remedy that.
Gosh, it's just fantastic. I just wanted to reflect back to you. I mean, it's just so fantastic to hear of the Haven. And I was wanting to ask you, what was the effect on the students' families that have come through the Haven?
It's been amazing because those kids have actually, people like Ngoc and Tuan now earn lots of money compared with their parents. And so they're able to, and of course the Vietnamese family is very important. So pretty well everything they earn would go back to the family. And then subsequently, like the doctor one, Tuan, his younger brother has also gone to med school.
Yeah, so there's a real knock-on effect.
It does. It has a knock-on effect. Yeah. And the students themselves say that, their 4 or 5 years at the Haven was the best years of their lives. The camaraderie, the support from the teachers and the tutors, that chance to get an education. And they really appreciate it. How so often in the West we're not that appreciative of our teachers. In Vietnam, they do really appreciate their teachers. And like Tom, whenever he meets any of them, it's not, oh, hello, Professor, it's Tay Tong. That means Teacher Tong. And every year on his death anniversary, pretty well all those students come back to the Haven because he's got an altar in the classroom area to pay their respects.
Gosh. Fantastic. One of the things that I've noticed is that often when people do things like create the haven, it comes from something that they themselves have lived through. And it's something that worries me a little bit because I think of my own background. I mean, I've had a very privileged background. I've went to a good school. I've had, great parents, great family, great friends, good jobs. And so the reason it worries me is I think, well, why would people like me get involved in something that's helping people who are, much less advantaged than me? And it always seems to be that if it's because of our experiences as children that have, very strong experiences of children, that people then go on, not necessarily, but a lot of people then go on to help others. And so I'm wondering what it would take for people like me who come from privilege to choose to do something like that. I'm not sure I'm being very clear, but
yes, I know what you mean. I mean, I think that, say, when people travel to Vietnam, they see the disparities. The poor areas, the street urchins, they still exist, and quite often that will motivate them. Like we have this wonderful friend who taught at James Fallon High School. And Tom met her in a lift in Hanoi. And I guess he'd talk to anyone. She clearly talks to anyone. And she decided then and there that instead of when the students go off to that Schoolies Week business, how kids in Australia go to Schoolies Week, she would offer an alternative of a trip to Vietnam. And she took them to places like the Haven to show them how the other half lived, that there was an opportunity for them to get involved in philanthropy themselves. And so every time you get someone doing that, and then she did adult tours to Vietnam, so she'd bring the adults to the Haven to meet the students. And it's quite likely that many of them went back and have made donations to various charities and what have you in Vietnam. In fact, I know they did to the Haven, for example.
So it's just exposing people to particular projects.
About exposure. I guess travel is the thing. If you stay in your own backyard, you're never going to learn anything about anyone else and how they don't live the kind of life that you live. I mean, I came from a good background with a great school, well-off parents. Overseas things like my sisters and I asked our principal if we could set up an international club at school and have guest speakers in. So there was something, even though we came from this really conservative farming community, very white bread, here were these girls wanting to know more about the outside world. And, hey, got my opportunity at the University of Auckland. And I met Talal. And it just changed my life. And just, it's my second home. I love it. I love his family. And that business about education, Tom was orphaned. So as a courtesy, after he met me and asked me to marry him, he wrote to his eldest brother and told him that he'd met this New Zealand girl whom he wanted to marry. And the brother wrote back with a single line, "Is she educated?"
Gosh.
And Tom and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary in Hawaii many years ago. I reminded him of that, and he was a little bit embarrassed. But the assumption, I think, was that if she's educated, she'll adapt, she'll adjust, she'll assimilate, she'll find all the good things about Vietnam. Isn't that interesting? That's all he said to Talal. Is she educated?
Gosh. Yeah. Yeah. Well, Judith, thank you so much for your time and for sharing about the Haven. And what I'm hearing is through all this is just the incredible power of education.
Absolutely.
Just incredible.
I think my message to everyone really is that the cycle of poverty can be broken through education. And if poor and disadvantaged children have that opportunity to get an education, they can go anywhere they want.
A fantastic message. And the other thing I hear is not to wait for governments to do it. You can just do it yourself. Just do it yourself.
You can do it yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I mean, just through.
Not too long.
No, not at all. But just through this interview, I mean, I've had tears in my eyes on several occasions, just hearing the stories about those kids that have it's changed their lives. It's changed the lives of their families. It's just and I've really loved hearing about how rich your life has been too. So thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Lovely to meet you. And of course, I can always talk about Vietnam. In fact, it's hard to stop me, really. So thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Brave New Women. Certain podcast sites such as Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or Podchaser let you leave a rating and a review. The more ratings and reviews we get, the more people will listen and the more these women's stories will be shared. So I'd really appreciate it if you could. Thanks for listening.